and we have to learn to see it in order to let go of it.
If you were striving in Dzogchen,
You can't let go of this.
I'm gonna say that was the consequence of all your Vipassana training. You were trying
I don't think so.
You were trying to figure out how to Vipassanize it.
No, I think it's a liability of, and not a liability. I think it in a way it's part of the path that everybody. That when the Buddha was talking about the example of right effort and of really understanding what that means, he used the example of tuning the strings of a lute, too tight, too loose. It's only by watching the mind, in these various ways, that we see, that we come to the balance of non-striving.
Well, in defense of your striving in Dzogchen, there are all the other things the other practices you get handed in Dzogchen beyond this insight into emptiness or non-duality. There's all of the visual stuff that gets emphasized later on. And
even aside from that, even in the Dzogchen practice itself, Sogni Rinpoche had a beautiful little piece, which I can't remember it in detail now. He was basically talking about the various levels of kind of attachment or striving in doing Dzogchen practice, as one is learning it. This is not after mastering it, but in the learning of it, the very natural tendency of the mind, maybe to get a glimpse of the empty nature of mind, and then wanting to sustain
to prolong it. Yeah.
So there are so many subtleties.
A good analogy that he uses for that very error is it's like ringing a bell and then trying to prolong the natural continuity of the ring.
Yeah.
So like you ring the bell, you ring it once, and then it lasts as long as it lasts.
Yeah.
You don't keep bashing the bell,
Yeah.
trying to.
Yeah.
So.
And it's just there are many. Each tradition has its own particular forms of, you could say, of doing it wrong. But that's all part of the learning. That's, if we could do it perfectly from the beginning, we'd all be enlightened masters. I guess I just want to, I'm not sure what this is in reference to, but it's just coming to mind in the moment. And in a way, for me, it ties together Vipassana and the Dzogchen and kind of all the traditions. And for me, the practice has become so simple and integrated at this point. And it really revolves around the Four Noble Truths, but in a very pragmatic way, not in a theoretical way. And so when the Buddha talked about Nibbana, or the free mind, as being the end of craving, and so he says this in many places, it's very explicit. There's the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering, and the cause of that is, we talked about a little bit before, kind of the wanting mind is itself a state of suffering. And the end of dukkha is the end of craving. And for a long time, I would think of that as being the far-off goal. Okay, if I practice, for 20 years or 20 lifetimes, maybe at some point I'd reach the end of craving. But at one point on retreat, I had a kind of realization that we can actually practice the end of craving moment to moment. And then it becomes very interesting to watch in all the ways we discussed, the kind of the wrong ways of doing practice. Whatever the practice is, whether Vipassana or Dzogchen or different techniques of Vipassana, that basically the wrong ways of doing them involves some kind of craving or other. It's wanting something. And that the release from craving in the moment, the momentary letting go of that wanting, that craving, is a settling back, you could say, into emptiness or into selflessness or into openness, into the empty nature of mind. As Tulku Orgyen would say, we do that short moments many times. We see the craving and the release from it, and actually pay attention to what that experience is of going from craving or wanting to not wanting, and recognize the nature of the mind free of craving.
Right.
Even if it's just for a moment or two, and then So we get caught again in craving, and then again release. So in one way, that becomes our whole practice, and that's the practice, essentially, of all the traditions. It's the end of craving, and it doesn't have to be seen in terms of simply a far-off goal. It's actually the practice moment to moment.
So I have one final question. I'll close on this, and the spirit of the question is, I would imagine, one you don't get a lot because you're in the business of teaching meditation to people who already concede that they want to learn it. But in my business, I am talking to people who are, as you know, rather radically skeptical of religion in general, as I think they should be, but by association of any project that has any historical entanglements with religion, in this case Buddhism. And so there's just the question of why do any of this, and why isn't this just no better than thinking happy thoughts or having a whatever reasonably happy life you can eke out by totally ordinary, secular, scientific, and non-introspective / spiritual pursuits. So there's a fundamental doubt of why is this interesting, relevant, why is this anything other than one of the variants of confusion that we see religious imbeciles fall into century after century. What would you say to someone who doesn't see the point in any of this or anything that we've talked about thus far? We sound like people who've been talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin to some number of people who are listening to us, if they've gotten this far. How would you start the conversation with such a person?
Well, I'd start the conversation by suggesting that people explore an app that Dan Harris and I just created and worked on.
That's my job as host. Let me tell us about the app that you and our mutual friend Dan Harris have just created.
Right. Well, as perhaps some of the listeners know, Dan Harris is an ABC news anchor, and he wrote this best-selling book, 10% Happier, after coming on a 10-day retreat and being really turned on to the potential for becoming 10% happier in one's life. But he came from the perspective of being a total skeptic. And his book is very funny and engaging, both about his professional life, but also about his meditative experience.
That's why I don't want that to blow by. That's why I recommend his book to people before I recommend my book. I recommend that people read his book, 10% Happier, before mine, Waking Up, because it's really the perfect introduction, especially for my crowd, because he was so skeptical.
Yes. Yeah.
And his entrance into this practice is so fraught with the consequences of his skepticism. It's hilarious and very, very useful. So.
Yeah, and he does it with tremendous humor. Yeah. And so we had the idea to create a meditation app for skeptics.
Right.
And it basically addresses that question, and part of it is dialogues that we're having together, and part are just audio guided meditations, all very short, 5 to 10 minutes in length. And it really is about both learning the skills of meditation in the service of first becoming a little happier in our lives, letting go of those patterns in the mind that causes suffering. It doesn't require any special outfit, or it's just becoming interested in what aspects of our minds and our lives are conducive to happiness and which are not, which just create patterns of suffering over and over again. And it's all very simple. It's very straightforward. We're all a mixture. We all have a whole range of skillful and unskillful thoughts. And we begin to see very directly, without an intermediary, the kinds of thoughts and feelings and emotions that are productive of suffering for ourselves and others. When we feel greedy or angry or envious or jealous, or a lot of what are called the afflictive emotions, we can see directly and feel directly their nature, and we say, oh, this would be good to let go of. And we see those kind of thought patterns and emotions that are actually happiness producing. But this is not theoretical. That's the beauty of meditation, that it's not theoretical. It's not just following what we read in the book. we're actually experiencing for ourselves the nature of these thoughts, of these emotions. And we see that, when we're feeling generous, we're feeling kind, we're feeling compassionate, it makes us happy and it makes the people around us happy. And so the choices become more obvious. This is not to say that in the first hour of our meditation, all the old habit patterns of our mind, the unskillful ones, are going to disappear. This is why it's called meditation practice. It takes a repeated seeing and learning to effect the transformation.
Well, can you say something about how being able to observe the nature of your own thoughts and emotions and reactions, merely being able to observe it translates into being able to change course in any way? That's not intuitively obvious that would be the case.
It happens, I think, in a couple of ways. In one very obvious way, we begin to see the difference between being lost in a thought pattern, where we're just carried away in a train of association, and we're just lost in the thought, in all the emotions involved with it, and it can be lost for a short period of time, it can be lost for a really long period of time. We see the difference between that and being mindful that the thought and emotion are present. So this is a huge understanding, because before people begin some kind of introspection, some kind of meditative discipline, mostly we're just lost in and acting out whatever particular pattern of thoughts and emotions are there. With meditation or with mindfulness, we're actually beginning to observe the fact that they're there as they're happening. And so that gives us a little space, gives us the possibility of not being carried away by them. And in that space, we have the choice. Do I want to build on this? Do I want to follow this? Or do I want to let it go? So that's one way the mindfulness gives us that freedom. Second way is what we actually learn from being mindful. And one of the things we learn is that all of these thoughts, emotions, and everything else are impermanent. That they're there and they're there for some time and then they disappear. And even though we all know this intellectually, we don't live it as if we know it. We take our thoughts and emotions to be so stable in who we are. So seeing the impermanence of them again and again and again begins to loosen the bonds of attachment to them.
It's interesting to be precise in describing just how much of a change this is experientially when you really grasp the impermanence of an emotion like anger, say. So how long would you say you could stay angry without being lost in thought about the reasons why you should be angry? So you're thinking about an argument you just had, say, and you're not aware of that thought arising. So you're identified with a thought, you're lost in the thought, you're getting angry, and now, because you know how to practice mindfulness, you notice a thought as a thought, right? You unhook from, you're no longer identified with that bit of language or image in your mind. And the emotion of anger is still present because it's a matter of physiology. It arose and it takes some time to subside. It has some sort of half-life. Most people are walking around with the impression that it's possible to stay angry for hours or even days, right? How long would you think you could be angry if you were not subsequently lost in the next train of thought?
I think not very long. Generally, when people are not watching their minds this carefully, may not be realizing that there's a pretty continual stream of thoughts that's feeding the anger. So we may catch a thought or two, see it, release a little bit, and maybe feel an easing of the anger, and then 10 seconds later or a minute later, another thought comes, which triggers the emotion again. Without that continual feeding of the emotion, I don't know exactly how long it would last, but it certainly wouldn't last as long as it usually does.
But I mean, I would put it on the order of seconds, not even minutes, and certainly not hours.
Right.
Like if you were actually completely unhooked from the discursive thinking that is producing the anger, how long can the emotion of anger stay present in your mind? You think you could be angry
No.
for 5 minutes?
Here, this gets to be an interesting question because it's really about then how we define anger. So, for example, the mind changes a lot more quickly than the body, right? Just the rapidity of change. So, the feeling of anger in the mind might disappear pretty quickly,
Right.
as you say, but there may be a residue of what we would call anger in terms of the bodily feeling.
Right, the
In terms of the tension or
physiological
tide, the
arousal.
yeah. So that may last a bit longer than the actual emotional feeling of anger in the mind. But emotion seems to me a complex phenomena that involves both the body and mind.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's hard to isolate just the mental aspect.
Yeah, well, it
emotion.
also has the physiology of two different emotions can be very similar, and it's the cognitive interpretation of what's going on.
Yes.
I think this is still known as the James Lange theory of emotion in psychology, going back to William James. Many, perhaps even before William James, have noticed that an emotion like fear or anxiety is very similar to a positive emotion like excitement, and yet it's the interpretation of that arousal that makes for the difference. So when you're no longer interpreting, and then you just feel pure physiology, in my experience at that moment, as you say, it goes to the question of what is an emotion, what is anger in this case. It's not mere physiological arousal, right? It's arousal that has a psychological significance and points to very likely some subsequent goal-oriented actions you may want to take based on this. It's a motive or a set of intentions. And when you break the spell of you are thinking about it and all you're left with is the physiology, I would say it ceases to be anger.
Yes.
It's basically has all the psychological import of something like indigestion or a pain in your knee, or I mean, it's something that really is just has absolutely no implications at all. It's just your body at that moment. But then again, as you say, if in the next moment you are lost in thought about why you have every right to be angry at this person, well, then it instantly becomes anger again.
Right.
So,
There's another component of this, which is, and this is kind of what makes the meditation so interesting, because there are just different levels to what's going on. So, so if we can unhook from the thoughts and we're just left with the physiological remains, of whatever the thought pattern was. So then the question becomes, how are we relating to those physical energetic sensations? If they're unpleasant, we may no longer be feeling anger towards the content of our previous thoughts, but we may be feeling, we could say, aversion to the unpleasant sensations that are the residue. So that becomes another level to look at. How's the mind relating to that energetic phenomena?
Right.
So that becomes another place of investigation.
So the flip side of this, and this is the other question we have more or less on this topic, can meditation or mindfulness be bad for you? Are there people who shouldn't meditate or shouldn't go on silent retreat? And I guess I would add to this, you've just talked about how increasing your ability to observe the flow of your own consciousness reduces suffering, seemingly almost by definition, and gives you an ability to choose more wisely. But is there a period in one's practice where seeing more actually just translates into more suffering or new kinds of suffering that wouldn't be there otherwise? So take both parts of that. Even if meditation is ultimately good for you, are there periods where it can certainly seem to be bad for you? And are there people for whom it's actually bad?
I think for different people at different times, it's not, I would say it's not recommended. Certainly in terms of intensive silent retreat. So something might be good in short doses, but in larger doses may not be helpful. For example, if somebody is really suffering from a deep depression, the isolation of a meditation retreat where people are in silence and not talking, that might be counterproductive. I mean, what might be needed more is some kind of engagement with other people, with therapeutic skills. So that would be one area where it would be worth looking to see, is the form of meditation the right form for what's going on.
And we should say that you do encounter this problem with some regularity on silent retreat, where people who have some psychopathology like schizophrenia get in over their heads, and it's just objectively bad for them to be in isolation and silence.
Yes. I would say that does happen, definitely, and over the years we've experienced that. It's not the common experience. For most people, the practice and the various forms of practice work well, but there are these cases where it doesn't.
So then there's the question of, even if meditation is good for you, there can be periods where it doesn't seem to be good for you, in terms of the character of your experience is getting worse by some metric.
This points to kind of a key question in understanding the appropriateness of meditation at a particular time. And it has less to do with what it is that's arising, whether what's arising is difficult or not, because in meditation lots of difficult things come, whether it's physical pain or really difficult emotions, or memories. So sometimes we're really facing different aspects of suffering in our lives. The question of whether it's skillful to continue and proceed really has to do with the quality of balance in the mind, and whether there's enough balance, enough mindfulness to hold those difficulties without being overwhelmed by them, without getting caught up in them too much. I mean, we do get caught up to some extent until we learn how to, create a place of balance. But that's where a teacher can be really helpful, because very often when I'm teaching retreats, and other teachers as well, if we see somebody losing their balance, really getting overwhelmed by what's coming up, we'll very often suggest back off a little bit, and go for a walk or relax or do a little reading as a way of titrating the speed of the material that may be coming up. So it's very much a question of finding the right balance for dealing with particularly difficult material. The difficulties themselves are not a problem. They come up for everybody. But it's really our capacity to be with them, either in a skillful way or not, and that's the key question.
The analogy I often use is to physical exercise. So physical exercise is, in a generic sense, objectively good and basically good for everyone. But if you have a specific injury, if you've got a bad knee, well, then you have to work around that.
Exactly.
And there could be some exercises you just shouldn't do because it's synonymous with hurting an already injured knee.
Yes.
So there's all of those caveats, and yet you can still say that exercise is good for you in general. And there's a kind of a range of competence where you see, though you will never be, say, an Olympic athlete, right?
You're not talking about me, are you?
Yeah, I will never be an Olympic athlete. I can still see that the same principles by which an Olympic athlete becomes an Olympic athlete apply to me and will make me as good as I can be at
I think that's a
pole
good
vault,
analogy.
And my pole vault is terrible. Have you interacted with Willoughby Britton, the scientist who has focused on the cautionary tales of intensive meditation practice, where she thinks that some number of people are harmed by meditation, and we in the scientific community have to understand that more and be less boosterish about meditation, certainly intensive meditation practice, and more honest that there's a potential downside here. I don't know her, and she's someone who ultimately I probably should have on the podcast, but is there anything to react to in there beyond what we just said?
Well, I think she has pointed to the fact that in intensive practice, where people are on like a silent retreat, meditating all day long, it can go very deep. We're really going into the psyche, on levels that we usually don't in our ordinary life. So it's a very powerful process, and we're learning things about ourselves on many, many levels. It's not just the content of our stories, which in some ways is the most obvious level, but we're learning about the basic ephemerality of our experience. And when we're experiencing the body as an energy field dissolving, which can be a meditative experience. It can be both exhilarating, but also for certain people, it could be destabilizing. Because it's very different than our usual solid sense of self. So I think she's pointing to that level of experience and the need to take a lot of care when we enter into that realm. And that's where well-trained teachers are really important. Because if somebody's not familiar with that terrain, as somebody enters into it, they may not be giving the best advice for how to stay balanced with it. And it's not to say that even well-trained teachers, may make mistakes in offering some guidance, although that doesn't happen so often when people are familiar with those experiences. As I said before, over the years of teaching, and it's something we've learned, and it took some time to learn it, is to know when people should back off, when things are getting out of balance. And with experience, that just becomes more clear.
Okay, next question. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on the use of meditation to cope with negative emotion. This is something we've already gotten into. Is it fundamentally misguided, from either of your perspectives, to use meditation to make yourself feel better when you aren't happy? So this cuts to really something that falls out of the definition of mindfulness, which we should probably just remind people what it entails as a matter of attention. Mindfulness, by definition, is a type of mere attention to the character of one's experience, which does not have an agenda. You have to surrender your agenda to be mindful, because your agenda would be subtly or grossly coloring your attention with grasping at what's pleasant or aversion to what's unpleasant. So you have to be willing to just be aware of an unpleasant emotion, a negative emotion in this case, or an unpleasant sensation, without seeking to change it. And yet the reason why one is mindful in the first place is implicitly goal-oriented, because you want to change the character of your experience. You want to be less distracted. You want to stop suffering unnecessarily. You want to be able to make the wise choices of the sort you just described. So how do you deal with that apparent paradox in the moment?
I think this points to an interesting question that I think is coming up more and more these days with the growing popularity of mindfulness, in more secular situations. There's even kind of a movement called secular mindfulness. And it really points to the need to define how we're using the word mindfulness in different contexts. Because in the ordinary way it's being used now, broadly speaking, I think one could define it in the way you suggested of just paying attention in the moment, being undistracted, coming back when you lost. So just a very kind of simple, generic kind of awareness, which is very helpful. That begins to open us up to a different understanding of our minds. But there are also deeper meanings of mindfulness, which become more significant when we undertake it or understand it as a vehicle for something more than simply being a little happier in the moment, but rather see mindfulness as a vehicle or a methodology for what we could call awakening, or a more profound spiritual understanding, that there's something else that it has the potential to reveal. In that meaning of mindfulness, there's not only a choiceless awareness, which you were talking about, but embedded in the meaning of mindfulness in that context is also, you could say, a discerning wisdom of what is skillful and what is unskillful, what causes wholesome and unwholesome, whatever words you like to use. So there is the acknowledgement and the understanding embedded in that kind of mindfulness that some mind states are the cause or cause us or others the suffering, that create suffering in our experience, both for ourselves and others. And there are certain mind states which are freeing. So already there's a wisdom component, in that kind of mindfulness, which takes us a bit further than simply being attentive to what's arising. It's like, it's attentive to what's arising, but also learning from being attentive. What is it we're actually learning from being mindful? And in that, you could say there is an implicit choice being made to cultivate the skillful and to let go of the unskillful.
Except in the moment, there's another level there where the choicelessness is actually the deeper insight, in that if you can truly be mindful of the anger, say, that was there a moment ago as anger because you were identified with thought and not being mindful, if you're truly mindful in the next moment, then you realize that anger is just as good an object of mindfulness, or the residue of anger is just as good an object of mindfulness as anything else, including a skillful emotion. This is the phrase "one taste"
Yes.
in the Tibetan tradition.
Yes.
So the agenda goes away in that moment of mindfulness.
Yes. It's almost like, I'm not sure I remember this correctly, so you might clarify it if I don't, but that Zen